Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning, it's 4 minutes after 9 on Thursday, January the 4th. A winter crisis for the NHS, expressions we've heard for too many years. And while for many, many years it's been able to be said that the Conservatives don't necessarily have that much of a healthy relationship with the NHS, is this the winter where that has been seen really in full stark highlight? The whole of January now. Initially it was going to be 2 weeks where effectively no non-urgent work would take place. Now the whole of January. As we've discussed before, we have doctors manning the doors of A&E to see if you really do need urgent care. And we have situations where hospitals now can put patients on mixed wards without fear of any penalties. So that's the picture. A gloomy one too under the Conservatives, although they say that they are working to a plan. They've invested more money than ever before, and they've been determined to keep the NHS performing the magnificent service that it once is. Well, let's turn now to the man who, presumably if there was a Labour government, would be in charge of the health service, the shadow health secretary. And I need to say Labour MP for Leicester South as well, the great city of Leicester, is John Ashworth, who joins me in the studio. Thank you for coming by the studio. Just briefly, there is so much going on, Mr. Ashworth, as we see the NHS, and it's fair to say the staff would appear to be doing an extraordinary job in very troubling circumstances. But it is crisis every which way you turn. How would you characterise what's happening?
Well, first of all, the staff are doing an extraordinary job, and, absolute tribute to those staff who have been working this Christmas, continuing to work flat out. We know how difficult things are for them, and it is indeed a crisis, and the fact that the NHS England, the NHS bosses here in London have had to cancel or put out recommendations to cancel all non-urgent operations reveals the scale of the crisis now afflicting our health service. Lots of experts saying it's the worst they've seen for years, even worse than last year, and if you'll recall, the Red Cross said last year it was a humanitarian crisis, and people are saying it's even worse than last year. What do we need to do about it? Well, we shouldn't really be in this situation in the first place. I was warning months ago that the government needs to better prepare for this winter. They casually dismissed my warnings. But what I think we need to do more broadly is deal with the fundamental problems afflicting the NHS. The fact that the funding settlement isn't satisfactory. 7 years, now 8 years of underfunding. The fact that we haven't really dealt with the huge vacancies and what we call rota gaps in the NHS. Vacancies for 100,000 staff across the NHS, 40,000 nurses. These are huge gaps in staffing in the NHS. But also some of the structural problems, and I don't want to get too technical because it can bore people, but fundamentally, the NHS and what we call the social care system doesn't integrate well together. And actually, a lot of the problems you see in the NHS over the winter time is because you have lots of very elderly people trapped in hospital with nowhere to go. Partly, a lot of it's to do with the huge cuts to what we call social care. Billions have been cut from it. But it's also because too often the NHS and our social care systems at a local level do not work as closely together as they should do. So you've got to tackle those problems as well. So they're the three big areas that Labour would want to deal with.
But to those who would say, we're talking about an area, and you'll have the figure to your fingertips, but the figure, I think it's over about £2 billion a week, roughly, to run the NHS. So it's a vast sum of money. Are they, in a way, victims of their own success, Mr. Ashworth, in as much as conditions that people present themselves with now, certainly 20 years ago, they wouldn't even be alive. We wouldn't even need to look after these poor souls, possibly even 10 years ago. Now, this isn't any government's fault, is it, that the NHS is actually getting better at doing what it does?
Well, the NHS is a great example of innovation, and this is the 70th anniversary of the NHS, and we should really pay tribute to all the tremendous advances that the NHS has been responsible for, from test tube babies to heart transplants to all the advancements.
Transplants and all sorts,
huge. Incredible advancements.
But the funding principle hasn't changed in 70 years.
Well, what you've got
is it time to have a conversation? I'm not saying, but is it time for wealthier people like me, if I want to go and see the doctor this afternoon, should I just pay 50 quid or whatever it might be?
No, I disagree with that. I mean, I do believe in the fundamentals of the NHS. When it was created 70 years ago by a politician called Nye Bevan, and he said it would be free for every man, woman and child, paid for out of general taxation. That, for me, was, if you like, an inspirational vision for the NHS, which has sustained the NHS for 70 years. And I see no reason why that principle cannot sustain the NHS.
People are staying alive far, far longer than they did in Mr. Bevan's day.
No, they certainly are. That is certainly true. But that's why you need to get the funding back to its long-term trend. For 62 years, the NHS broadly got a 4% increase a year. It obviously was a bit more under Labour governments, tended to be a bit less under Tory governments, but that was broadly what it got. Now, under the last 7 to 8 years, it's had like a 1% increase. It's just simply not enough. And when you actually take into account...
£2 billion a week, Mr.
I know, but
you're happy that money is well spent?
Well, you can always find ways to spend the money better, but it hasn't got enough money in the first place. And remember, government is about priorities. And this is a government, and I know you will get bored of us Labour politicians saying it, but the government's found £1 billion for the DUP, it's found £1 billion for corporation tax cuts, it's found £1 billion for an inheritance tax cut. You can make different decisions in government, and you can put the money in if you want to.
Let's get the calls through to you now. Janet is in Newcastle. You're through to John Ashworth. Go ahead, Janet. Morning to you.
Good morning. I'm going to make this quick because I'm in the middle of prepping someone for theatre.
Oh, right.
Now, I'm a student nurse. I'm in my first year. If I wanted to become a teacher, I could get up to £26,000 of funding and bursary. Because I want to be a nurse, I get absolutely nothing. I will leave my degree with £54,000 of debt. It is disgusting. There's no support for student nurses. And we don't just wander around following nurses around. This morning, I'm prepping someone. I've taken dressings down. I've been going down to theatre with somebody. How can you justify not helping students? And if I vote for you, as a student nurse, will you bring back bursaries? Because we desperately need it.
Yes. Very simple question, Janet. Thank you for ringing. Absolutely. We went into the election saying we'd bring back those bursaries for all those very eloquent reasons that you've just outlined. We think burdening people who want to become nurses with that level of debt is simply unfair. And you know what? When the government got rid of the bursaries, the applications for nursing courses, particularly for more mature applicants, because a lot of people go into nursing sometimes as a second or even third career, actually dropped. So we would bring back that bursary, yes.
How would you fund it? I have to ask that.
Well, we said in the election that our plans for NHS expenditure, which would be about an extra £6 billion a year, would actually be funded by changes to taxation. So we were asking the top 5% of earners to pay more tax, and we were going to reverse some of the corporation tax cuts. Now, increasing
there have been questions asked, haven't there, by the IFS over whether your not your personal questions, sums, whether your sums actually add up.
Well, we believe we have. We remember we got into lots of discussions about me and you on this in the election. You became a bit of a star in the election for some of the scrutiny.
I do like the odd sum, yes.
For some of the scrutiny you put some of us under. But look, we believe that we costed every single one of our policies, unlike the Conservatives.
I've said you didn't.
Well, we believe we did, and we got into this debate with the IFS, and we produced a detailed spreadsheet of how all our different policies would be costed, and we believe we could do it.
Quick word from Janet. Go on, Janet.
Can I just ask you, are you aware that we spread our time 50% at university, 50% on the wards? Are you aware we do 13.5-hour shifts for free? For free? We turn up and do those shifts, and we do not get paid a penny. We borrow money to go and work for the NHS for free, and then we'll leave in 3 years' time with over £50,000 worth of debt. People don't realise when they go on towards those student nurses are there for free. No, and we're doing 13.5-hour shifts as well. Absolutely.
I was just discussing this, funnily enough, with De Montfort University in Leicester, who were involved in training nurses, discussing this very issue. And basically, by taking away your bursary, we're exploiting your goodwill. That is what, when I say we, I mean the government, that is what they are doing, which is why we in the Labour Party have said we want to bring that bursary back.
What would the impact be, lastly, Janet, for you and people like you if the Labour Party was to get into government and was to reverse this policy?
Well, what happens is we borrow £9,000 a year for our fees. We borrow £9,000 to live on, but that doesn't, it pays your rent. Yes. And possibly your bills, but it doesn't give you anything to eat or travel to and from the hospitals with. So then we have to do bank shifts. So if we're on the wards doing 3 13.5-hour shifts a week, we then do 4 night shifts.
All right. I will end it there, Janet. Good luck with what you're doing. I'll let you go back to your patient. Thank you for your call. We move to another call. Nick in Stoke Newington. Nick, you're through to John Ashworth. Go ahead. Good morning to you.
Hello, morning.
Morning, sir.
My call. The NHS at the moment is being shrunken, and we've had decreases in beds and staff and funds to levels never seen before, and that is the reason for the crisis we have at the moment. And the government's current plans, the new accountable care organisation plans, seek to provide another massive reorganisation on the basis of what's a health and social care integration is what they're sort of carrying this move on. But that can all be done without any further major reorganisation. What we need is the reversal of the Health and Social Care Act and to take competition marketisation out of the NHS altogether, and then we can talk about what needs reorganising.
So what would your question be, Nick? Because I have so many people who want to talk to John, Mr. Ashworth.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right, not at all.
will you support and campaign for Alison Pollock's NHS reinstatement bill and reverse the privatisation that's already happening in the NHS?
Stay on the line, Nick. Mr. Ashworth.
Okay, then. Well, what you've asked is quite a broad or a big question about the structures. Look, we absolutely agree with you. The way in which the Andrew Lansley reforms to the way the health service worked, which he brought in about 5 years ago or so now, we think have been an absolute catastrophe. They wasted billions, but it has allowed more and more parts of the NHS to be privatised. It's allowed this crazy situation where Virgin Care was able to take the NHS to court a few weeks ago in Surrey and force the NHS to settle out of court. You've got all these examples of private health companies winning community health contracts across the country, delivering a service which I don't believe is satisfactory and not in the interests of patients. We want to end all that. We do want to reverse the Health and Social Care Act. We do want to reinstate the NHS, and we would bring forward the relevant legislation to do that. You've asked a technical question about something called ACOs, which are a new way of delivering healthcare, and the worry is about these ACOs is that they will be, and many campaigners are arguing that they will be used as a Trojan horse for more NHS privatisation, which is why we've come out and said we oppose American-style ACOs in the United Kingdom. We've actually called for them to debate and vote on them in the House of Commons, because as you said, Nick, these changes can be pushed through with no parliamentary scrutiny whatsoever. So we put down what you call an EDM. I don't want to get too technical for the listeners, but what we call an EDM, demanding a vote in the House of Commons on this. So we've been very firm on that.
Quick one-sentence response from you, Nick, if you would.
Well, I'm pleased to hear Jonathan Ashworth committing to that, and I think ultimately, beyond the immediate funding crisis, which is the real issue here, we need to look at the future and the future of the NHS.
All right, Nick, thank you for that. This again speaks to the economic plan that you put forward. This is the plan that one of your colleagues, Angela Rayner, a senior ally of Jeremy Corbyn, admitted in an interview with is a high-risk gamble. It's a S word, which I can't repeat, and it rhymes with knit. It's an S word or bust strategy. Is that how Labour plans to deal with the economy and economics then?
I've not
or bust?
I've not seen Angela's interview, and I'll have to go off and read it. No, we will run the economy in a prudent way.
We're in different times, your colleague says. Radical times. We need to have a real investment in Britain's future. Genuinely, I don't mean that as a slogan. I mean it as an economic strategy. It is a bit of an S or bust strategy. I get it. It's a high-risk strategy, but all of Britain's great advancements in the past have been because we've had the gumption to take a risk, she tells The Spectator.
Well, I think she's making the point.
Some of my listeners, isn't it?
Well, I think Angela's making the point in her way that we're going to invest in the economy, we're going to invest in jobs, we're going to invest in infrastructure, we're going to invest in industry, and we're going to invest in the NHS, not just because it's about delivering the best quality of care, but actually the NHS or healthcare across the United Kingdom is about 10% of the economy. By investing in the NHS, you're actually investing in a high-skill, productive part of the economy which contributes to economic growth. So I would argue investing in the NHS makes good sense, good economic sense.
For, Mr. I mean, can I put it to you, if we just take the S word out, that is the strategy. It's a bust strategy, isn't it? Take the S word out, that's what it is. It's spend, spend, spend.
No, I mean, we've got, the government have reduced corporation tax to some of the lowest levels. We just want to get it back to what it was in, a few years ago, which would still be lower than what it was for much of the past 30 years. But if you do that, then you can invest in the NHS, which contributes to economic growth as well.
Paul's in Brecon, and you're through to the Shadow Health Secretary. Paul, go ahead. Morning.
Hi, good morning. In Wales, the NHS is run by Labour, and one of their policies is to have free prescriptions for everybody, with the result that each and every human being in Wales, right down to the babies, gets 24 prescription items a year. That's right across the board. Does John support that policy, or and wish to roll that out in England, free prescriptions?
Mr. Ashworth.
Well, it's not the policy of the English or the United Kingdom Labour Party, and it's not our policy for the English National Health Service, because it would cost a lot of money. And although I don't have an ideological objection to giving people free prescriptions, I am aware that I would need to pay for that. And given that there are so many other huge challenges facing the English NHS at the moment, I've got to say, well, even though we're putting an extra £6 billion in, I would want to reassure myself that £6 billion is dealing with the problems we've got now. But as I say, I don't have a kind of principled objection to it, but I just don't think we've got the money for it.
Why should I get it free if I'm in Brecon, but not have to pay for it if I'm in Bristol? Crystal? How fair is that?
Well, because that's what happens now when you have devolution, isn't it? We've devolved a lot the Welsh NHS to the Welsh Assembly, but that is how devolution works in the United Kingdom. I mean, there's a similar situation.
I'll come back to Paul in a moment. How do you suppose the Labour Party in Wales is doing running the NHS? It's been the subject of some fairly negative headlines and valid criticism.
Well, there have been struggles, but with the Welsh NHS, you've got to remember that their overall budget has been cut as well. But on some of the indicators, they do better than England. I think they do better on cancer, for example. But I will concede before you throw it at me, are having a difficult winter as well. But you have got to remember that their overall grant from the United Kingdom government has been reduced for the NHS in Wales as well.
Let's go back to Paul. You're there, Paul. What would you say to Mr. Ashworth?
Well, first of all, I'm amazed that he doesn't support Labour policy. Where policy is run by Labour on NHS, he actually goes against it. So where you actually run it, they go against it. Labour, and then he's coming with policies to pay for it, such as corporation tax, which in effect is hitting productivity, because the pound left inside the company, not the pound withdrawn for profit, for dividend, but the pound left inside the company is best invested in making that company more efficient. And in actual fact, the policies hit directly against productivity. They're trying to please everyone with everything, and it is a bust economic model they're going for.
Well, I haven't pleased you, have I? So that strategy of trying to please everyone clearly isn't working. So.
But what about the point that Paul makes lastly, which is you seem to be against the Labour Party, where the Labour Party is actually in office, in power, you seem to be against what they're doing?
No, I mean, when you have a devolved situation, you will get different policies. I mean, the Scottish Labour Party will have different policies from the English Labour Party, from the Welsh Labour Party. That is the logic of devolution. And I think 20 years ago, when we went for these devolved parliaments and assemblies, I think we all have to accept that would mean that the different constituent parts of the Labour Party would sometimes have different policies in different parts of the United Kingdom.
Let's move on to other areas. Christoph is in Fulham. Christoph, you're through to Mr. Ashworth. Go ahead.
Morning, gentlemen. Morning, Mr. Ashworth. A question for you. You talked about the 1947 tax-funded model that Nye Bevan set up. The real architect of the NHS was arguably William Beveridge just a few years earlier in 1941, who talked about a social insurance model, which would have meant that anyone would have paid the minimum and anyone who wanted to would be able to pay more than that for different aspects of care. Isn't it that tax-funded, tax-limited model that's landed us in the mess that we're in currently, because the NHS doesn't have enough money? Your only answer, frankly, is to pump in money that's raised from tax. There are other alternatives. Is Labour up for considering those?
Well, I remember that Bevan rejected the social insurance model, I believe, in his chapter in Place of Fear, which, as a historian, I'm sure you recall as well. Now, I believe the NHS, universal, publicly provided, publicly administered, paid for by general taxation, is the fairest and indeed the most efficient way of providing healthcare. I don't accept that a social insurance model, as proposed by Beveridge and mooted by you, sir, would solve the problems facing the NHS today. And if I may say so, you'd sort of dismiss the concerns around funding. All the different think tanks, all the experts recognise that the NHS isn't getting the money it needs today, because over the last 7 to 8 years we've had austerity economics in the NHS. We've had essentially flatlining 1% when traditionally the NHS would have got 4% increase a year. And it's not the only problem, but that is a big fundamental that needs to be tackled.
Quick response from you, Christoph.
Can I, if we look at systems in France and Germany and Switzerland, I'm sure you know about these because they were set up post-war, based in many cases on Beveridge's model. These systems function much better than the NHS. I'm a doctor in the NHS. I go often to European countries. I'm sure, Mr. Ashworth, you're familiar with these countries. You get a GP appointment the same day. You can get a hospital appointment within a few days. You can be treated for non-urgent operations within a week or two. They cost a bit more than the NHS, and people have much more flexibility. And it doesn't undermine the basic principle of free care and free in inverted commas care, because you're not barred from any aspects of care, and universality. So I would say that the sort of mindset that you are stuck in, which is a 1940s mindset, is not going to serve this country well for the next few decades.
But if I may say so, as you'll be aware, in those countries you've mentioned, on a head-for-head basis, they have a higher expenditure on their healthcare than they do in the United Kingdom. Now, it may well be that they do that via a social insurance system, but there is more money in their system. They probably a higher proportion of their GDP goes to healthcare than the United Kingdom.
Do you know why that is? The major difference is in voluntary spend. And in Britain, that voluntary spend is either is lower because it's not spent, or it's spent purely on the private sector. What I'm talking about is harnessing that money for the NHS.
Well, then what you're saying is that we should have a social insurance system where people are essentially asked to top up. Well, I don't think that's fair or equitable. That's the sort of ideological difference between us.
Last point, Christoph. Last point.
You're misrepresenting social insurance, and this is the fundamental problem, I'm afraid, in this debate. And we won't have long enough now to discuss it. But with social insurance, you don't have to top up. You know that very well. But you can top up, and it's that extra voluntary top up that makes a huge difference.
Thank you for that. I will bring you in, Christoph. I'm grateful. You talked about there are other factors. In a way, while it is, of course, important we look at central government, we look at funding, as you have highlighted quite fairly, are we perhaps abusive in some fashions of the NHS? You'll have noted yesterday that it's estimated that 8 million missed appointments cost around £1 billion. There's the aspect of health tourism, which is impossible by its very nature to put a figure on, but we're talking probably tens of millions of pounds. Are there measures that can be taken quite easily to try and get some of the cash that is already in the system directed to the right areas?
Well, I do think we have to be more responsible as individuals. I'm not one of these people who I'm not in favour of penalising people where this debate does sometimes go. But obviously, we do have to remember that if we make an appointment, or if an appointment is offered to us, that if we can't make it, we do have to tell the various health...
Yeah, but if we repeatedly miss appointments, shouldn't we pay a £10 fine? I just picked the figure out the sky.
No, I don't...
If only you're not elderly or vulnerable.
Sometimes there's very good health reasons why people would
I miss half a dozen appointments?
Miss those appointments. Well, I'm not in favour of penalising people, but I do agree we need to be more responsible, because as we all get older, and we all live with various different conditions, actually... The gentleman earlier said I'm stuck in the 1940s. I'm not actually, because in the 1940s what would happen is you would get ill, you'd go to the hospital, they would fix you, and then you'd go off again. Right now we're all living with conditions. The NHS is keeping us alive, but we do have to take some responsibility ourselves. We have to try and take responsibility for how much we're drinking, how much we're smoking.
Yeah, but we're not encouraged.
Diet.
There's no carrot or stick towards that.
Well, I think we need to look at ways in which we can be encouraged. I'm not in favour of penalising people who drink too much, but I do think we have to ensure that our public health systems are properly resourced and running the sort of campaigns and offering people the sort of programmes and initiatives to encourage people to take responsibility to live healthier lives.
Yes, but when you read in the paper, say, one household in Barnet, North London, called paramedics 3,594 times over a 12-year period ending in 2017. That's 10 times a day. That's a ridiculous waste of money and services, isn't it? Somebody like that, there should be action taken.
Well, that seems like a very specific case, and that would suggest to me that there are underlying issues there which I would have thought the authorities should look into in a case like that. I mean, that is obviously it's not a typical case, that is it?
All right. No, it's not, fortunately. Linda's in Manchester. Linda, you're through to Mr. Jonathan Ashworth. Go ahead, Linda.
Oh, good morning. I'd really like to know, if you can, if you could clarify Labour's stance on Brexit for me, considering what Tony Blair said recently.
Well, Tony Blair has said today, of course, that there's too much timidity, that Jeremy Corbyn should be forcing the Conservatives to own Brexit as a Tory Brexit. Jonathan Ashworth.
Well, I mean, Brexit is... the people voted for Brexit in the referendum. I'll be honest, I was a Remainer. Very passionate about Remain. I campaigned for Remain. Obviously disappointed by the outcome, but I accept the outcome. The city of Leicester, which I'm very proud to represent, voted for Remain as well. So that gives me some reassurance that I'm in tune with my with my voters. But it's a national referendum, and we have to accept it. And I think the position of the Labour Party now is to accept Brexit, but to put pressure on the government to ensure that we get the best possible deal and make the best of it. There are people who are passionate Remainers who don't think we can get any deal which is in the interests of the country, and I respect their point of view. I understand their point of view, but I think telling people if you voted one way, sorry, you were wrong, we're going to ignore you, I just think that would be terrible for democracy.
Linda?
Well, that's very nice, but how far will you go to in your acceptance? What kind of Brexit? Is there such a thing as a hard and soft Brexit, or is there just Brexit means Brexit?
Well, I mean, it depends what the deal is. So, I mean, this is a discussion about the NHS. There are over 100,000 people from the EU who work in the NHS in our social care system. I would say that all those people from the EU who work in our NHS, their rights should be guaranteed. They should be allowed to remain. The government have now begun to move to that position as well. But I would also say if the NHS, given the level of vacancies we have, should be able to continue to recruit from the EU if necessary. I obviously would prefer us to train more people in the United Kingdom, which is why I want to bring back the nurses' bursary and things like that. But I also understand that the NHS needs the supply of nurses and doctors and clinicians from the EU, and I wouldn't want to stop that. So that would be a big part of that would be a big red line for me in any Brexit deal.
Before we go back to health calls, one final question on this. How helpful were the comments from Tony Blair for Mr Corbyn today, telling him how he should run his side of PMQs?
Well, actually, I actually missed Tony Blair's. I don't know why I'm calling him Tony. I've only met him once or twice, but I actually missed his interview on the Today programme because I was doing interviews elsewhere on the NHS. I mean, look, he's a former Labour Prime Minister, and Is
Mr Corbyn taking the right stance, the right position for the Labour Party?
Yes, I think so, because I think what you're seeing actually is Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer, our shadow Brexit spokesperson, putting real pressure on the government. I think David Davis is all over the shop on Brexit. He was saying that we had all these detailed reports.
Your deputy leader saying he wouldn't rule out a second referendum just a couple of weeks ago. Aren't you? Not you personally, but the Labour Party's all over the place as well, aren't they?
Well, our position is not to offer a second referendum, but I think what Tom Watson was musing upon is that there may well one day be another it'd technically be a third referendum because we had a referendum in the 1970s. There may well, I don't know, in 10, 20, 25, 30 years be another referendum for all we know.
Want to go back in?
Well, there may well be. I mean, I think he was probably being discursive about that point, really, rather than anything else.
All right. Jeff's in Leighton. Jeff, you're through probably one of the last calls to Jonathan Ashworth. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, hi Nick, hi Jonathan.
Hello, sir.
The thing I really want to talk just very, very briefly is that I thought, as a type 2 diabetic myself, I really, really feel strongly that type 2 diabetes should be, at some level, should be taken out of the NHS completely. Because I think it's so much about lifestyle choices, obesity, lack of exercise, and all the things that I got control of in order to control my diabetes so that I didn't have to take medication. So that I now, in fact, I'm healthier now than I was before I was diagnosed as a diabetic in reality. And I just think that really a responsible government is really going to create a situation where the public feel as if it's their responsibility, it's their choice, so therefore they have to take responsibility for it.
I think you've raised a really interesting question. I mean, I think the NHS should remain the response of the NHS to deal with diabetes, so I disagree with you on that. But can I make a broader point? If you think back to the sort of 80s, we had very, very graphic anti-smoking advertisements, anti-drinking advertisements, informing us of the implications of smoking and drinking. I don't believe enough people in the country realise how devastating type 2 diabetes can be until they get it. And I think we need an equivalent...
Can it always be... I know you're not a clinician, but can it, in most cases, be controlled by diet or exercise then?
I think it can be controlled. I mean, I'm not a clinician, but I mean, obviously, control is very important.
Yeah.
But I think I am struck by the number of people who develop type 2 diabetes and are utterly shocked at the implications of not getting it under control. And I think we need an equivalent campaign to all those sort of anti-smoking, anti-drinking type campaigns we used to have, which just tells people of the implications of diabetes, because it's actually costing the NHS billions of pounds. It's costing the wider economy billions of pounds, and I think people need to understand obesity, not getting control of your weight, the effect that does have on your individual health.
Jeff, thank you. You were the last call. A couple of last questions from me. We know what January holds for the NHS. Mr. Ashworth, how do you think February might fare? And what are you hearing about this possible flu epidemic, which was fairly big in Australia? Of course, they've now entered their summer period as we hit their winter. If it does travel up, we've got even graver problems on our hands, haven't we?
We certainly have. And we've got various clinicians beginning to sound warnings about flu and that it could hit. Back in November, I warned the government about our flu vaccination rates and said they weren't good enough. We just all hope and pray that we don't have a big flu outbreak in the country, because we know that could be incredibly serious for the National Health Service. And of course, February will also mean that these cancelled operations will work their way through the system, and it will actually mean that the waiting lists, which are already at 4 million,
drops back.
They'll actually get higher. And there'll be people who will have spent this Christmas getting through Christmas in the knowledge that in January their operation is coming. It's been overhanging them, and they're now very anxious, waiting to know whether a letter is going to land on their doormat telling them that their operation for a knee replacement or a hip replacement is going to be delayed again, and they'll be waiting even longer in pain and anxiety. And just think about the toll that will take, especially on very elderly people who have to wait even longer for their hip to be replaced. This is simply not fair on them. And that's what it is about today. We can get into an argument about the statistics, and I'm guilty of throwing around statistics as a politician, but we've got to remember the human impact of what is going on in the NHS today.
Lastly, it was about 12 months ago we started a series of conversations about the GEMS policy that we brought in, our emergency medical staff, and I know you and your Labour colleague Chris Bryant have worked very hard on this. As you understand it, is that now progressing into law?
Yes, because what happened is we put it forward from taking inspiration from you. We put it forward as a Labour policy, and then my colleague in the House of Commons got what we call a private member's bill. It's very rare that you get this, but it's a chance for a backbencher to change the law.
This was Mr Bryant.
Yeah. He actually, interestingly enough, did a poll of his constituents about what law they wanted changing, and this topped the poll.
Is that right?
So that shows you how popular or how serious people take this. And he put it forward, and the government, in fairness to them, agreed with him and have said, yep, we're going to take this forward, we are going to change the law. So it's going through the system, and hopefully the law will be changed soon.
Well, thanks for your help on that last year. It was hugely appreciated. Thank you for coming by the studio. I wish you and your family a successful new year, and the good people of Leicester South, and particularly the football players. We wish them a very successful 2018. Jonathan Ashworth, Shadow Health Secretary, appearing here on LBC, where the news is next.
Figures released shortly on NHS delays are expected to confirm the health service is more stretched than ever before. The Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth has told LBC underfunding is one of the main reasons for the current winter pressures. Tony Blair has dismissed allegations that he warned Donald Trump that UK intelligence agencies may have spied on him. The former Prime Minister says the claim, contained in a new book, is a complete